This conference will now be recorded.
Thanks. Okay, good morning to all of you and everybody out in TV land. To begin, I'll introduce myself. My name is Michaela Bishop, and I'm with the Department of Human Services, Developmental Disabilities Services Division. And we provide supports in people's homes and in outside of their natural homes, but in regular homes, sometimes 3 people living together. We also provide employment services and various therapies for folks with disabilities. We do not operate any intermediate care facilities, but in the past, I've provided a lot of technical assistance for some of the intermediate care facilities. And many years ago, I worked at the what used to be the state school in Pauls Valley, which is now closed. So I worked there for a number of years. So I know the Title 19 standards very well that the ICF IDs are required to follow. What I was asked to talk about today really relates more to community services and just kind of a little history on developmental disabilities as well. But if anybody has any questions that I might be able to answer, particular to intermediate care facilities that serve those folks, I'll be glad to try to answer if I know it. Some of you, I don't know if you're going to be administrators in those facilities. I've only got 3 people here, but I'll ask you 3. And the folks on online with us, does anybody have a family member with intellectual disability, or have you ever worked with individuals with intellectual disabilities?
Well, I was in child welfare for 10 years, so we had a lot of those kiddos, and I worked in behavioral health for a long time, and so I serviced a lot of those families in their homes and got them on Social Security, and got on the wait list for the waiver.
Eligibility for
for the waiver.
Yeah.
So
okay, very good. How about anybody online? Feel free to speak up. Okay, that's all right. We're moving on. There we go. So I thought I'd start with some history. It's kind of interesting, really, some of the history. We won't spend a lot of time, but what I'm going to show you is kind of mixed in together national history as well as Oklahoma history. So it's in line. So you'll kind of see when something was happening nationally, where were we in Oklahoma? And if something was happening in Oklahoma, what was happening nationally? Kind of thing. So the first institutions, which is basically what we consider the intermediate care facilities for individuals with intellectual disabilities, were built back in the 1850s. Yeah. Always try to beat it.
the mouse has to be on.
It is because I just changed
on the
it.
screen.
Yeah, I did it to that. Well, it'll be interesting if I have to keep walking.
Do you want me to just sit over there and click it?
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see how it works out.
Okay.
Maybe I'll stay on this side of the room. In 1909, Oklahoma became a state in 1907. Oops, we got somebody. Make sure you mute yourselves. Somebody's got some feedback. Anyway, so a couple of years later, the Oklahoma legislature designated funding for the state's first institution, which was called the Oklahoma Institution for the Feeble-Minded in Enid. Isn't that a fantastic name? Then the next year, several years later, then it was renamed the Enid State School. I don't know if we have any Enid folks in our crowd. Okay.
They're close.
Yes, they are. Yep. It doesn't want to. Could be that even the battery's dead on this. wonder if I can do this. Aha. I'll put this right here.
Well, there's a will, there's a way.
See if that'll do it. So this was the Institute for the Feeble-Minded in Enid. Kind of a almost White House looking building. In fact, that's what we called it. I guess, maybe.
All right.
We called it the White House.
It's still there.
Yeah, it
There's
sure
just a
is.
bunch more buildings around it, but yeah, it still stands there.
Yep, yep. And that was a facility that the state operated. Well, I probably should have had these slides reversed, but in 1907, there was a facility in Pauls Valley called the Training School for White Boys, wayward white boys, actually. And it was later converted to the Hospital for Epileptics and then became the Pauls Valley State School. So then at that point, we had two state schools, one in Enid and one in Pauls Valley. There's the original Pauls Valley, probably back before it was even used for folks with disabilities. Because I worked there and none of those buildings are there, I can tell you. Also today, I'll tell you, you'll hear me, the way I talk about folks with disabilities. Of course, hopefully everyone knows that the term mental retardation is gone. We don't use that terminology anymore. We also use what's called people first language, and individuals who have developmental disabilities. Did I get it? Yep. Thank you. Okay. Oh, you didn't have it on for me? Well, I didn't know I had to turn it on. I would have thought that would have been part of the service of this establishment. But anyway, so people first language, and it's folks with intellectual disabilities have a self-advocacy group that they call themselves People First. And they kind of got this movement going. Don't refer to us, they would say, by our disability. We are more than our disability. Our disability is secondary. You know, we're people first. That's where they got the term. Then we just happen to have a disability. So you'll hear me saying, she's a person with an intellectual disability. He's a fellow with Down syndrome. You won't hear me saying he's a Downs or he's a tube feeder or any kind of term like that, which is considered degrading. I mean, you wouldn't want to be, you know, called by some feature. So keep that in mind, and hopefully you start to hear that. And then when you're out in public, you know, you'll start to hear those kinds of things. You become more sensitive to that kind of language. I find it's interesting. Folks with disabilities, that's one of the last groups probably, especially intellectual disabilities, that we pay any attention to language, because I would bet that everybody here, including me, have used the terms, you know, you're a moron, don't be an imbecile, you know, don't be an idiot. Well, in case you didn't know it, those were the original classifications of people with intellectual disabilities. When they would even when I started at Pauls Valley, and I'm old, but I'm not that old, there were assessments in the records that said, you know, Sally functions at the imbecile level of functioning and things like that. So that's where those terms came from. They were actually references to people with disabilities that we picked up to what? To insult somebody, essentially, to tell them how stupid they are. You know, you're so stupid, you're a moron, you know, that kind of thing. So interesting. We still say things like, I hear it all the time, don't be a retard, don't be retarded. Again, a slanderous term. You know, we've learned a lot of other terminology, the N word, not to use that, you know, and it's not polite, it's rude, it's insulting. But yet we have this other language that we continue to use because folks with intellectual disabilities can't speak up for themselves the same way other groups of people can. So I'll hear things like, you must have rode the short bus in school. What are they referring to when they say that? The bus with folks with disabilities. And it's not a compliment, is it? It's an insult. So the more we can do to kind of change, I think, people's perceptions is great. Okay, that was my public service announcement for the day. Now, at the time, in the early 50s, institutions were starting to develop because there just weren't other places for people. And doctors would say, oh my goodness, when you had a baby and it had an apparent disability, oh my goodness, so sad. You'll want to put that child someplace where he or she can be well taken care of and get training and all that kind of stuff. But some parents chose to keep their children at home. And in the early 50s, the parents would band together and form their own specialized schools and work training centers. There wasn't anything for their kids. And their kids weren't allowed to go to school because, they weren't capable of learning anything. So here were parents stuck with their kids. So what else would they do except come together? Well, we'll get together. We'll have some place for them to go during the day and do things. Now here in Oklahoma, here in Oklahoma City, actually, one of the first schools was the Dale Rogers School, founded in 1953. Now, if you're old like me, you know who Roy Rogers and Dale Evans were. TV personalities, cowboy personalities, they had a Western show, they sang, all kinds of great stuff back in the 50s. Well, they had a child who had Down syndrome as well as some other health issues. And at one point, I don't remember how old she was, but she died young. And Dale Evans Rogers wrote a book called Angel Unaware. I don't know if you can even still get the book. I read it. But the Dale Rogers training school still exists in Oklahoma City, but now it's the Dale Rogers Center. And they have a trophy making company, I guess you would say, called Prism Place. They make trophies for baseball teams and everything like that. They employ folks with intellectual disabilities. They also have a work center for folks who are not capable of working in the trophy area, but who do other kinds of work tasks. They also provide some residential services. And in the front lobby, they have a whole kind of a little museum area dedicated to Roy Rogers and Dale Evans. Kind of interesting to go and see some of that memorabilia that was left for them. Here's an example of an early classroom. 1957 is what it says. Pretty large classroom, even if you're talking about typical kids, let alone kids who have some additional needs for support. Then in 1961, President John F. Kennedy created the President's Panel on Mental Retardation. And I don't know if folks are aware that President Kennedy had a sister, Rose, who had an intellectual disability. There she is, Rosemary Kennedy. For quite a long time, Rosemary, she lived at home with her family. The Kennedys, they were a large family. There were lots of brothers and sisters. She was brought up with them, just like them. And because they had money and some privilege, they were able to put her in schools that helped her develop a lot of skills. But as her brothers and sisters got older, and she just, she noticed that she was not advancing as well as them. In this picture, she looks like anybody else, as do most folks with intellectual disabilities. Because she had been brought up, it had been modeled for her, how to dress, how to act in society. She went to the debutante ball and all that good kind of stuff. But of course, as they continued to advance, get careers, get married, have children, she noticed, she really saw the differences between herself and her brothers and sisters. And she had a lot of mental health issues after that, trying to deal with all of those things. And back in that time, there were a couple of doctors who were touting this great new procedure called lobotomy. And basically what they would go in was divide, separate the fibers that connected the sides of the brain. And so her father, Joseph Kennedy, thought that might really help her because they were saying how much it helped calm people who were agitated, and that was a lot of what she was doing. So he had her lobotomized, basically. And of course, she was never the same after that, lost a lot of skills. And the family kept her out of the limelight for herself, as well as for themselves, because they were a very prominent political family. And, you know, you kind of want to keep anything that's not fabulous about your family out of the spotlight. Okay, so there we had the early 60s nationally, and then in 1964, the HISA Memorial Center in Sand Springs was completed. So that became basically the third state school, state-operated facility in Oklahoma. And at their peak, each of those facilities had about 500 people living in them. So 1,500 in these three public facilities. Then by 1971, the federal Medicaid program had established standards of care for the institutions, again, which they called ICF-MRs. And those were the Title 19 standards that are still in use today. I'm sure they've made some revisions since 1971, but a lot of it still stands. And then in 1975, Congress passed Public Law 94-142, the Education for All Handicapped Children Act. This now started requiring, that kids with disabilities be included in school, that schools had to have programs for them. And that law still stands today. They are provided funding to do so. Now, schools still have a long way to go, and it's tricky for them. And some schools don't have much money, so the kids are sent to other nearby schools a lot of times. But they're required by law to provide services to kids with disabilities. Doesn't have to be in the same classroom as typical kids, and most of them have segregated classrooms. But some are really doing a good job of mainstreaming the kids with disabilities in with their non-disabled peers, which of course is great, because where you're going to get the best role models other than other typical kids, so that these kiddos are learning what everybody's wearing, how they're doing their hair, what kind of words that the kids are using, what kind of games they're playing on their video games and that kind of stuff. So this is mid 1970s. The first efforts by the Oklahoma Department of Public Welfare, which is now the Department of Human Services, to develop services outside of the institutions resulted in the formation of sheltered workshops, which were run by nonprofit agencies, many of which were founded by parents. Again, trying to find a place, especially for their young adults. What are they going to do if they were getting any kind of schooling? What happens to them once they graduate or get out of school? Nothing. There's nothing for them. They haven't developed any work skills. Their educational skills are probably rather minimal as well. So got to have something for them to do. So the sheltered workshop model was founded. Now, sheltered workshops, just to give you a little bit on them, and they still exist, they are allowed to provide a sub-minimum wage to individuals that work there. Through the Department of Labor, they can have what's called a sub-minimum wage contract, meaning that they can pay less than minimum wage. They can pay people basically based on their performance. So in a nutshell, if you and I are able to, let's say, package 20 golf balls in a box for a company, and we can do 20 boxes in an hour, let's say, and we get minimum wage to do that. If the individual with disabilities can only do 2 boxes in an hour, they are allowed to be paid 20% of the minimum wage, okay? Which isn't much, if let's say, for ease of math, that's for my sake, not for anybody else's. Let's say minimum wage is $10 an hour, then they would make $2 an hour. If I've got my math right. Hopefully I do. So, you know, folks are making some money, but is it really much money? You know, it's not. So there are some flaws with that. Plus, the other flaw is how do you determine that person can only work at 20%? Let's say, for example, that the person has very limited use of their arms, of their hands. So it's very difficult for them. That's why they're only able to do 2 boxes. They understand what they're supposed to do. If their hands, you know, if they could do everything they needed to with their hands, they'd be producing maybe like anybody else, but they can't. Well, sometimes there are adaptations that can be put in place to help that person. You know, if the person can't count, for example, and you know you need 20 balls to a box, you can create what they call a jig, something that if they fill every hole, they've got 20, and then they know they have 20, then they put them in the box. That can speed things along. You know, there are all kinds of adaptations like that. And so making sure that people are getting all those advantages and all those things to help them perform better, because otherwise they're stuck making $2 an hour, you know, forever or whatever, until minimum wage changes. But even at that, it's not going to get them much more. So there's a lot of movement out there to do away with a sub-minimum wage and to move towards a minimum wage, at least for everybody. It's kind of interesting stuff. But at least the workshops, and their intent was to give people someplace to go outside of the home, to give their caregivers relief, as well as give them something to do during the day and to become productive. Then in 1981, the group home program was started. So right now we've only got, you know, these public institutions, maybe a couple of private ones popping up. Otherwise, people are still living at home with their family. But Donna Nye, Governor Nye's wife, started the group home program for adults with intellectual disabilities. And we still have group homes today. Most of them are around 4, at the most 6 people living together in a home. When you get, you know, the homes are in the communities, in a residential neighborhood like you and I live in for the most part. What happens when you get more folks, particularly more than 6, it's hard to find a house that size. So you build one, and then what? Does it look like every other house in the neighborhood? No, it doesn't tend to. If every other house in the neighborhood is a 3-bedroom, 2-car garage house, and you've got one that's, you know, way bigger and has 2 double garages or something, you're like, wonder what that is. That doesn't look like a house. So we really worked to keep the groups smaller so they do fit in with their communities. The first 10 group homes proved to be such a success that the legislature continued to fund the program. And in a few years, there were more than 60 across the state. And we still have, like I said, quite a few group homes. Now, you know, in the intermediate care facilities, there are intermediate care facilities for 4 people, on up 4-bed, 16-bed, you know, on up to larger facilities as well. And some, I'm not sure because I haven't been in that arena in a long time, if those really small ICFs are when they are being developed and approved, if they're being built in or around regular neighborhoods. For a long time, those facilities were built away from the regular community, kind of outside of town or on a property that the company already owns, those kinds of things. So I'm hoping they're moving more into communities so people are a part of their community. Then in 1981, 8 families who had children, probably adult children by this time, at the Hissam Memorial Center filed a lawsuit because the conditions at Hissam had become so bad, they were really concerned. They saw abuse going on and various things. And again, that was operated by my division, I can tell you. back at this time, because I started with the state, I started at Falls Valley in 1983. And the lawsuit was filed not very long afterwards. At the same time, in 1981, is when the federal Medicaid program began developing ways that states could use the Medicaid money, could divert the Medicaid money that was going into institutions, that it could be diverted into community programs. We called those waivered services because they're waiving, what it was waiving the requirement for an individual to require institutional level of care. I mean, in a sense, we still have that as part of eligibility. They have to need the skills, skill development that a facility would provide, need that institutional level of care, but the money can now be diverted and waived and pay for services in the community instead of automatically having to go into a facility. Everybody mute themselves? We're hearing something. One time we had somebody was watching TV while they were also on this because they didn't have their mic muted and we could hear their TV show. So Oklahoma's community waiver program was approved and started in 1985. I started in Pauls Valley in 1983, and when the community services program started, I moved over. Took a job in the community services program in 1985. So that's how old I am. I was there when the program started. And again, at that time, there were 1,500 individuals living in the 3 state facilities. Now we get more into the lawsuit. It was called the Homeward Bound lawsuit. In 1987, Judge Ellison in Tulsa ruled that HISM be closed and that all 420 residents at that time be moved into community settings. And we were on a sharp timeline to get that done. By that time, I had moved up to state office in Oklahoma City, so I was involved in a lot of that stuff. The state appealed because, you're always going to try to appeal because it cost a lot of money to move folks and to move them quickly. Wasn't that we didn't agree they should move out, but it was more a matter of the money than anything. But in 1990, the state agreed to end the appeal. A consent decree was issued, and we had a deadline of 1994 to get everybody moved out into an appropriate community setting. And then at around that same time, the facilities in Enid and Pauls Valley changed their names to the Enid Northern Oklahoma Resource Center and the Southern Oklahoma Resource Center. The intention being to make those facilities more usable and accessible to the community, because the ICFs had therapists, on staff, people who had been working with folks with disabilities for many years, lots of experience, trying to make it a place where families could come and get a wheelchair fixed or whatever their need might be. Hence the change in the name. And then the last resident moved out of HISM on April 22nd, 1994, ahead of schedule, 5 months ahead of schedule. Now, the community services for those individuals, the class members, continue to be monitored by a panel. And then the state petitioned to have the oversight ended, and that ended in 2005, nearly 20 years after the suit was filed. So a very long one. The interesting thing about HISM, I think it's coming up. I think I have a picture of it. HISM being newer because it was created in the 1960s as opposed to Enid and Pauls Valley, which were created back in the early 1900s. HISM was Lloyd E. Rader was a powerful director of DHS back in the time. He was like king of everything. Even the legislature bowed down to him, so to speak. And that's when things started going bad at Hissom. It had been his kind of baby for a while. He put lots of resources and money into it, but over time, those things disappeared, went down. There wasn't a lot of oversight. There was oversight through the health department and other places, but not like there should have been. That's why it went kind of downhill. Then in 1992, a 52-bed facility, the Robert M. Greer Center, was built on the campus of the Northern Oklahoma Resource Center, the Enid State School, to treat individuals with dual diagnosis, which for our purposes means folks with an intellectual disability and a co-occurring mental illness or other kind of behavioral issue. If you work in mental health, for them, co-occurring typically means mental health issue and some kind of substance abuse issue. So ours is just a little bit different. And that facility is still there. It's pretty new. They built it and we still use it. We consider it a short-term treatment facility. And it is an ICF IID. And we try to get folks in there who are just failing in the community because of behavioral issues, mental health issues. They try to get them stabilized so that they can move back out in the community as quickly as possible. Then in November of 2012, the Oklahoma Commission voted to close the Northern and Southern Resource Centers. A big part of the reason for that was money. Really, again, a lot of those buildings were original, had been there since the early 1900s. And it was very difficult to get them up to code. You've probably, in this training, you've probably talked about, if you haven't had the fire marshal here, or I think the fire marshal is going to come and speak, as well as others, but codes are always changing. The requirement for sprinklers and certain kinds of doors and yada, yada, yada. And those buildings were so old, it just becoming financially unfeasible to continue. And by this time, when they voted to close those facilities, their numbers were down to about 140 or so each, I'll say, way down from 500. Because we've been working to move people out, and we've been offering the folks that live there and their families the opportunity to move out into the community. Now, many families wanted to stay there, especially if they put their kiddo in the facility back in 1950s, because that's what doctors told them was the best thing. And now their child is, 50 years old. Who wants to make a big change then? They're elderly parents. And they knew their child was being cared for there. And all of a sudden you're telling me, oh, he's got to move out. That kind of thing. This was pretty difficult for a lot of families. When we started moving folks out, all the folks that I had worked with when I was there, I was realizing they're the same age as me. I mean, I was assisting to move out folks that were my age. We'd kind of grown up together. Then in 2014, there's the White House in Enid. The Northern Oklahoma Resource Center closed. You see some of the other buildings around it. And then in 2015, the Southern Oklahoma Resource Center closed. So we closed our big facilities. Of course, Hissom had closed during the lawsuit. Now, there continue to be over 100 smaller intermediate care facilities that range in size from about 4 to about 160. Most are now serving about 12 to 18 individuals. And I think, the health department does the monitoring and surveying of those facilities. And I think they're encouraging smaller facilities as well, because there are a lot of the things in the regulations, in those Title 19 regulations, talk about individuals getting out in their communities. And it's difficult, when you serve a large group of people, it's hard to take people out in the community. Nobody wants to go out in a herd, and how does that look to other people when you see this herd of people climb off a large van and go in someplace, you kind of stay back like, oh, who are all those people? But if you can take people out one or two or three, it's much easier to go to Walmart. It's much easier to go to the mall, to go to the movies, to go out to eat, whatever kinds of things. Now, new federal regulations were being written to require settings to be in the community and services to be received like everyone else. So the feds are starting to rewrite their requirements for folks to be in their communities, to be living in their communities, for their homes to resemble other places around them and not look like a little, little hospital stuck in the middle of houses or something like that. And for folks to receive services like everyone else. In the institutional model, and especially the bigger facilities, you've got doctors and nurses and therapists as employees, or at least contractors. All your services are there. I remember, in Pauls Valley and Enid, we had our own barbers, we had our own laundry service. We had, we had cooks who cooked the food there. There was hardly a need to go into town for anything, which kept folks isolated and unknown to the other community members. I think you guys have on your syllabus to watch that movie, The Boys in the Bunkhouse, or Adalisa, I think it's called. Was it somewhere in there? I'm thinking I saw that. I could be making that up completely, but I was thinking that might be in the list, but it's a really, if it's not, you might want to watch, I think it's called Adalisa, Atalissa. It's very interesting sort of documentary on some guys who were moved out of an institution in Texas, and there was a businessman who had an idea that, oh, here are some adult males moving out of this facility. I can put them to work somewhere, because they were fairly capable guys, and he put them to work at a turkey farm up in Iowa. And anyway, it all kind of goes bad, because you see that maybe there was a good intent when it started, but then over time things deteriorated. It's a really interesting story. Anyway, it's because it's a true story. So you might look that up if it's not something you're required to watch or read. So now we're kind of up to current times. We still have facilities that exist here in Oklahoma. Like I said, anywhere between 4 and 160, but those numbers may be lower even at those larger facilities. But we now have community services that have started in the early 80s and have continued to grow and get funded. And that's what I'm going to talk some about now, so that you're aware. And even if you work as an administrator in one of the ICFIIDs, knowing that these services exist and feeling free to call on us sometimes for resources or for training or for ideas or anything like that. I've done technical assistance with some of the facilities that have run into issues. I didn't say it in the beginning, but my background, I'm the director of training and the director of psychological services for my division. And a lot of times there are, folks who have behavioral challenges, and facilities may not know what to do. We'd be glad to provide some technical assistance and help them with that, as does the health department themselves. We've worked with the health department on things at times. But here's the mission of our division: to help individuals with developmental disabilities and their families help themselves to lead safer, healthier, more independent, productive lives. It's not, we don't want it to be our job to take over someone's life, decide what they need, decide what they ought to do, because that just breeds dependence on us, on our system. We want to enable folks and their families to help themselves, to support them to move on to lives that they value. talk a little bit about how our services are funded. I mentioned it earlier when I talked about Medicaid monies being waived and moved over to community services. And we operate, and I'm going to actually, I'll get into that in a minute, but we operate 4 waivers. What we had to do was write up this waiver, this huge application for Medicaid, and submit it and get it approved. And we actually have 4 programs, which I'll talk about in a minute. We also provide some state-funded programs that are purely state dollars. The waiver programs pull down federal dollars, which is great for the state, you know, because we know our state's gone through a lot of hard times, especially when the price of oil goes down, the price of gas goes down, our revenues go down. And then on occasion, we have some folks who do private pay for some service. At the end of, I should have updated this, but we're serving 7,800, 8,000 people right now through our programs. We're always dependent on the legislature giving us additional funding to serve folks on our wait list, which you had mentioned the wait list. There's, as of last October, our wait list is basically 5,800 people. A lot, because what folks, you know, when folks hear about our programs, and this was probably true, you knew about the wait list, and if a new family comes in to apply for Social Security or something, or to get their Medicaid benefits set up through the county offices, a worker who knows the programs will say, oh, you should sign up for, you know, DDS services now, because there's a long waiting list. So a lot of kids get their families sign them up. Because right now, I think, we're working cases from 2007.
I always thought it was like 12 to 13 years. That's what I told
Yeah.
families.
Yeah,
Because so at least by the time they aged out, if they could get them when they were little.
right. Then by the time they hit that adult, and maybe the family
go with
is
that.
older then and not able to support them at their home, they may be eligible for the services. Yeah, get some residential services or whatever else they need. Because schools are required to provide a ton of services for kids. Therapies if they need it to benefit from their school program. But once you hit adulthood, that goes away. And there's not then just a lot of general resources out there for folks. We have just issued a contract. It's not done yet, but to a company to call everybody on the wait list. I mean, it's going to take a lot of work, but contact them all and see who still needs services. Because when we get funding to start working the wait list, let's say we get $1 million allocated for the next year, that might serve approximately 200 people or so. So our intake workers call the families if they can still find them. You know, if they've been on there for 10 or 12 years, they might have moved out of state. They no longer need our services. Or they've just moved and their phone number changed or their address changed and they didn't notify us. But if we can track them down, you know, do they still need services? Sometimes the individual may have passed away. Sometimes they don't need our services anymore. We do have some, you know, talked about some of our state-funded services, and some of our group homes are state-funded. They might have managed to move their family member into a state-funded group home, for example, so they don't need anything. So it's going to be really interesting to work through these 5,800 cases and see what we really end up with, how many really still need services. So we may be able to move a lot faster, you know, move up on the wait list a whole lot quicker when we know that. Talked about our waiver services. These are the programs, some of the basic programs that we provide, and I'll get more into those in a minute. Our community waiver services. Like I said, we have 4 waivers. We have what we call the community waiver, which was our first one, which is the most comprehensive waiver. And the individuals who receive services through that waiver may live in their own homes, continue to live in their own homes, or their family home, or they may not be able to, and we provide residential supports. Usually, typically, our typical model is a 3-bedroom home that's rented, and 3 individuals live together with the level of staff that they need to help them, support them there. We have vocational services. We have therapy services if they need it. We serve, in that big waiver, we serve children and adults as well. Now, like I said, with children, because they can get therapy services through other programs. One of them is called EPSDT. I won't go all into that, but we don't provide, they're required to access those services before they can access ours because they should be able to get therapies and various things. We use a person-centered planning approach, which means it used to be, we have a team approach where the individual's team made up of our case manager, the individual, their family, maybe some therapists, whoever else is working with them, come together and develop this team, basically develop this plan, basically a treatment plan for the individual. But a lot of times that was prescribed by professionals. In my professional opinion, I believe Johnny needs to work on blah, 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 kind of thing. But did anybody ever ask Johnny, what does he want to work on? And for sure, what does the family, what do you want to see Johnny do? Because we could work on physical therapy and, range of motion kinds of things. But maybe what Johnny, he doesn't, nobody's going to say, oh, I want to improve my range of motion. That's not what anybody says. People say, I want to be able to go bowling with my friends, or I want to be able to stand in my kitchen and cook my own meals. They don't say, I want to improve my standing ability so that I can stand for at least 15 minutes at a time. That's the kind of goals we used to write. Mary will be able to stand without support for at least 15 minutes a day, blah, blah, blah. That's not an outcome. That's a part of getting to an outcome. The outcome is she wants to be able to stand in her kitchen and cook her own food, something real. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about a person-centered approach. What does that individual want? What does the family want to see happen for the person? And build off the strengths the person has. I've worked with some guys who are masters at taking stuff apart. The agency and the staff are not happy about it because he may, if they're not watching him, he might dismantle the toilet or take apart the radio in the house or something like that. But can that also be a strength? Yes, it can, because sometimes there are jobs where you have to disassemble things, old components come in and need to be disassembled so they can be reused or shipped out or something like that. So what would have been considered a weakness or a problem, oh my God, he took the toilet apart again, can become a strength, in a work setting. Like Johnny's our fastest worker. He took apart 20 of those radiators or whatever, Oops, somebody needs to mute, unless you're asking a question, of course. Are there any questions? I tell you what, let's take a little break, shall we? Take about 10 minutes, come back at 11:15.
This conference will now be recorded.
Like talking to God, and occasionally God answers. Just tell me when you're ready to start. Okay, hope everybody's back with us. If you were listening to our conversations about tests and various things, I can't tell you what, I don't have any idea what's on the test from this information, sorry. I thought maybe I should find out and I'll make sure I emphasize it. Still talking about our community waiver. As we were talking about on the break, we have 4 waiver programs. We're still talking about the first one, the community waiver. Everybody in our service system has a case manager. Most everybody in our service system has a case manager. And we talked earlier about the team model that we use. which at its core, at least it's the individual, their family member or guardian, and the case manager making decisions. Then we have our in-home supports waivers, and we have two of those waivers. One of them is the in-home supports waiver for children, and one is an in-home supports waiver for adults. Now, our community waiver program does not have a cap on the amount of money that can be spent. We've got some individuals on the community waiver with very high medical needs, for example, who are living in the community. Otherwise, they might be living in a hospital type setting, who need nursing around the clock, various other kinds of things. Their plan of care, their treatment plan can run up, well over $100,000, $200,000 sometimes. Then on the community waiver, we also have individuals who live in their family home and might not need a high level of support. And so their services might be $20,000 a year or something like that. And so from that, we developed the in-home supports waivers. And in this waiver, individuals live in their own homes. They can't receive out-of-home services. They can't move into one of our, a residential kind of placement. They continue to live at home. And it is a capitated service. I don't know if I have the most current amounts, but I have it on another screen. But these waivers have a cap on them. You can only spend so much money. And this is where folks start when they have made application for our services, when their name comes up on the wait list. We start with in-home supports because it's our goal to keep people in their own homes if possible. Now, if they've got elderly parents or if there's some other reason they cannot remain at home, then we may move them onto our community waiver. But otherwise, they live at home and they have access to all the services that we offer, but they have to kind of pick and choose. If it's therapy that they need, they may want to spend their money on therapy. If it's new wheelchair, new equipment, they may put their money there. If it's an adult who they want them to have someplace to go and do during the day, then it might be one of our employment programs that they choose to spend their money on. Some individuals who have the need for adult briefs, things like that, they may spend their money on those kinds of supplies. Like I said, we have two waivers. The children's waiver is for eligible children ages 3 through 17, and they can receive up to about $16,000 a year. And again, children are required to access these other programs that exist for them. Typically, children are required to be in school. They have a school program and required to access those programs before hours. So that's not a lot of money in a year. And then the adult waiver, eligible adults 18 years or older can receive up to $23,000 as of October. They get a bit more money, again, because there aren't all the resources out there that are already available for adults. And so those parents of children and the adults and their family members decide how they want to spend that pot of money for the year. I think I just went through that. We can skip one. This is not a waiver. This is one of our other programs. The families, I need to move my fourth waiver up farther back. The Family Support Assistance Program. This is a separate program. This is totally state dollars. Now our waiver programs, like I had mentioned that we get a federal match on those. I'm going to say it's roughly 70% federal. So, and what that means is that we put in state dollars and we get back a 70% match on that federally. So that $1 of service is costing us 30 cents in the end, because we'll get 70 cents from the feds for it. But like our Family Support Assistance Program is totally state dollars. So that doesn't go as far. We want everything to capture federal money that we can. Because then if we have $1 million state dollars, let's say, it goes a whole long way if you're getting 70% more of that handed down to you from the feds, we can serve a whole lot more people. The Family Support Assistance Program is just a payment to families that they can do with as they wish. They're not on our waiver programs. It's completely separate. And if they choose this program, they get the payments that are listed here, $250 a month for one individual in their home, up to $400 a month for 2 to 3, if they did have 2 to 3 individuals in their home. If at some point they want to go on the waiver programs, they give this up and they would be moved to the waivers if that level of service is needed. So a lot of families are going to use this maybe for, if they've got kids, maybe for babysitting services, you know, other things like that. We do still have group homes, as I said before, for 4 to 12 people, but we've really reduced down from 12 people. But the group homes are for individuals who are pretty capable. They just need, you know, somebody around to help them with some day-to-day kinds of things. So you may see a group home that has 6 individuals living together and 1 staff on duty supporting them. 18 years of age. We used to contract with, we still do. We have a couple of homes that we share with child welfare for kids with autism. So we do have a little bit in terms of children, but it's mostly for adults. We also have agencies. We contract with the agencies to provide these services too. Let me say, we don't operate our own, you know, we don't operate any homes. We don't operate any employment services. We contract with agencies that do that all across the state. Sheltered workshops, we talked about that. Center-based services allow individuals to work and receive training that they may need to hopefully get a more independent job. And there's where it talks about workers are paid in accordance with their individual production. Real interesting. The rules around that I find really interesting. You may not, but I was talking about how you could be paid less than a minimum wage. And the way they determine that is they take, like we've got three people sitting here in class today. They would take 3 non-disabled workers and have them perform the task, whatever it is. Like we said, boxing golf balls for a company, for Titleist, let's say. That's the only golf ball name I know. So they would have you practice for a little bit, and then they would have you 3 box golf balls for an hour, and then basically take an average. How many did you guys do in an hour? So we're going to say you each did an average of 20 in an hour, and the pay for that, and they would check what's the pay out there nationally. They can't just make up the pay. What do other people doing that job or a similar job make? We're saying $10 an hour. So, okay, that's what, so boxing 20 boxes, $10 an hour. Then they bring in the individual with disabilities, let him or her practice a little bit, and then they time them for an hour and see what their productivity level is. That individual did 2 boxes, so their current rate of pay is 20% of that $10 wage, and that's how it's set up. And the requirement also is that now there's an hourly wage or a piece rate wage. And if you're being paid hourly, then they're required to reassess that individual at 6 months, because if he's been doing it for a while, his skills are going to improve, we hope. And if we put some adaptations in place or whatever, make it easier for him, hopefully he's doing 4 boxes, 6 boxes, 20 boxes. And so he needs to be reevaluated at least every 6 months, because otherwise we're cheating him. You know, he's still getting paid for 20 boxes, but he's now, for 2 boxes, but he's now doing 6 boxes in an hour. So they're required to do that. On a piece rate, which is where you get paid by the item, by the box. So if you're doing 20 boxes in an hour, you'd be getting 50 cents an hour based on a $10 minimum wage. So you're getting 50 cents for, or something like that for each. I'm getting into math again. It's going to weird me out. But your money's going to automatically increase as you do more boxes. If you're getting 50 cents or $1 a box, then you're going to get another $1 if you're doing more boxes, and another $1 and another $1, that kind of thing. Anyway, there's your little story about how that is supposed to work, so that people are treated fairly and getting the wage they actually should earn. We also provide community integrated employment. That provides placement, job training, in actual jobs to assist individuals in maintaining employment within the community. So, you may have the individual working at Pizza Hut. You may have the individual working for Xerox, for Walmart, for whatever company out there. And they may have a job coach who works with them side by side, helping them do the job. And that job coach is teaching them how to do the job, plus guaranteeing the company owner that the job will get done until that individual is able to do it on his or her own. Companies aren't going to hire an individual who can't do the job and may not be able to, how do I know he's going to be able to do the job? How does the job get done if he can't do the job? And so the job coach, that's part of their job. They're teaching the individual and making sure it gets done until the individual can do it on their own. And then the job coach backs out as the person becomes more proficient. Another program we have is called Assisted Living. This is a really small program that we have. This is for individuals who are pretty capable, live in their own home. They might have an apartment somewhere, and they just need a staff coming in once in a while. They come and go on their own. Maybe they even drive or take the bus, have a job, all that kind of stuff. But they need a little assistance once in a while with budgeting, with other things, navigating their benefits, whatever, those kinds of things. And that's what this program is. It's really small program, state funded as well. So they might have staff that see them a couple of times, a couple of hours a week, checking in, how are things going? What do you need help with? That kind of a thing. Right now we have more than 100 contract service providers. We're probably more like 120 now that offer services to people and can include therapies, transportation supports, adaptive equipment, other kinds of support. I don't know what happened to let me tell you real quick, what happened to I don't know what happened to the other waiver, but the fourth waiver that we operate is some class members. It's the Homeward Bound waiver. It's specific to class members because when the lawsuit was going on, there were specific promises that we made and that were put into the court documents on certain kinds of services that would be offered to the class and would always be offered to the class members. And that's why it became a separate waiver, because those services are only for class members. And of course, that's a waiver that's eventually going to go away as the class members age, as they pass away, or as they move out of our services and choose not to have services anymore. But that is our fourth waiver. So, I don't know what happened to that slide. I'm going to have fun. Anyway, does anybody have any questions that I can answer about this? I don't know if anybody's planning to work at an ICFIID or anybody? Anybody? It's close to lunch. I think it's lunch on your agenda next. It might be. Was that a question? The start of a question? Okay, well, if there aren't any questions, then I'm done. So enjoy the rest of your